Okay. Good evening and welcome. I'm Kathy Brewer, President of the Daughters of the Cincinnati. Since we have some non-member guests with us tonight, I would like to introduce you to our organization. The Daughters of the Cincinnati was incorporated as a society in 1894 by a group of descendants of the Revolutionary War officers. Its original mission was to advance and encourage the Revolutionary War history. To this end, the Society awarded its first academic scholarships in 1906 to the daughters of U.S. Army and Navy officers. Today, the scholarships are available to daughters commissioned officers of all armed forces. Over the past 115 years, we have awarded 615 four-year scholarships. Not only are we proud of our achievements, but we are very proud of our recipients. They are a remarkable group of young women. I welcome you tonight as we listen to Dr. Selig, and I now turn this meeting over to our historian, Carolyn Waite. Thank you, Carolyn, for all the hard work you've done to make this evening possible.
Many thanks, Kathy. Welcome, everybody. One of the purposes of the Daughters of Cincinnati is to advance and encourage investigation and study of the history of the Revolution. This year marks the 240th anniversary of the campaign by Washington and Rochambeau's armies from Newport, Rhode Island to Yorktown, Virginia, and victory in October of 1781. As historian, I've started a series of reports about this incredible campaign that stretched over 700 miles. And this Zoom program is one of these reports. Tonight, we're very pleased to present Dr. Robert A. Selig, a well-known scholar of the American Revolution, to speak to us about the important meetings between Washington and Rochambeau in Greenburgh, New York, during the summer of 1781. Dr. Selig is a specialist on the role of the French forces under the Comte de Rochambeau and serves as project historian to the National Park Service for the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route National Historic Trail Project. He received his PhD in history from the Universität Würzburg in Germany and has authored numerous books and articles. As a fun fact, his doctoral dissertation was entitled Mangy Sheep and Greedy Shepherds, Immigration from the Prince Bishopric of Würzburg in the 18th Century and Its Causes. Among his many awards, he was decorated by the French government as Chevalier de l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques in August of 2011, primarily for his work on the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route. We're also pleased to welcome as our guest tonight, Susan Seal, who's president of the Friends of the Odell House Rochambeau headquarters, Johnny Carawan, who's the trail administrator for the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route National Historic Trail System, which is part of the National Park Service, Larry Abel, National Chairman of the National Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Association, Inc., which we generally refer to as the W3R US, Julie Odell, who is National Vice Chairman of the W3R US, Ellen von Karahan, Executive Director of the W3R US, and we're especially pleased to announce that the proceeds of this program will be split between the Daughters of Cincinnati Scholarship Program and the W3R US organization. And I should mention also that Dr. Selig is graciously donating his time and expertise for this program tonight. And without further ado, I give you Dr. Selig.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Brewer and Ms. Waite, for this very kind introduction tonight. Allow me to welcome one other person, if I may. I'd like to, if Sally de Bartza is on, welcome Sally. Sally is a longtime supporter of W3R. She's an president emerita of the organization, and I can remember very many nice hours with her, with Sally, both in New Jersey as well as at Yorktown, where she has been for years laying the wreaths actually for the Daughters of the Cincinnati at the French War Memorial. And with this, then let's start by looking at the title that I gave this presentation tonight, Tuesday, August 1781, the day that shook the world. the day that shook the world. In the privacy of his headquarters in the Joseph Appleby House in Westchester County, General George Washington wrote in his diary in the evening of Tuesday, 14 August, and I quote him, matters have now come to a crisis and a decisive plan to be determined on. I was obliged, from the shortness of Count de Grasse's promised stay on this coast, the apparent disinclination of their naval officers to force the harbor of New York, and the feeble compliance of the states to my requisition for men hitherto, and little prospect of greater exertion in the future, and here it comes, to give up all idea of attacking New York, and instead thereof to remove the French troops and a detachment from the American army to the head of Elk to be transported to Virginia for the purpose of cooperating with the force from the West Indies against the troops in that state. He wrote this in the privacy of his headquarters, the Joseph Appleby House, and here's an old photograph that was just discovered in the Odell House. Now, we all know the result of Washington's decision of cooperating with the force from the West Indies, namely the French fleet under the Count de Grasse, that completes the siege ring around Yorktown and Gloucester, because on the 19th of October, 1781, Lord Cornwallis marched out of Yorktown and Tarleton over out of Gloucester to lay down their arms. Now, this brief paragraph in Washington's diary describes, in the typical understatement of Washington, the most momentous decision in his career, with consequences not only for US history, but for world history as such. But it is a long way, literally and as well as figuratively, from the 14th of August, 1781 in Greenburgh to the 19th of October, 1781 at Yorktown and Gloucester. Now, there's an old saying that goes that in every journey, the first step is always the hardest. What I want to do today is take an in-depth look at that first step taken in the early evening of 14 August, 1781, a step that will eventually shake the world, or put differently, turn the world upside down, as the famous line goes, some 66 days and 450 miles to the southward from Greenburgh and from the Appleby House and from the Odell House. The journey that begins, that I'll be talking about in Westchester County, is commemorated by the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route National Historic Trail. And now you realize why we're calling it either VARO or W3R, because it's not nice to have to say three R's in a row, and it's even harder for a French person. W3R, what is it? It is the story of the movements of Continental Army and French forces from New England and New York to Yorktown and back between July 1780 and May 1783. It's about the movements on water and on land, and of the cooperation with and contributions of France and the citizens of the United States to this victory in 1781 and the achievement of American independence in 1783. The goals and purposes of this National Historic Trail, VARO in National Park Service parlance, or W3R, is to identify resources. In the case of the area that we'll be talking about, for example, the Odell House or the Fishkill Supply Depot just upstream, to identify resources in the states along the route and to develop plans to preserve and interpret. This is all done with a view toward the campaign of 1781 as a diverse cross-cultural experience. By cross-cultural, I mean both Franco-American, because few Americans had ever seen a French person other than on the far end of a musket during the French and Indian War, as well as intra-American. And not a lot of people from Connecticut or Massachusetts had ever been to Virginia or Southern Maryland, as well as cross-cultural between whites and blacks and Native Americans, people, Catholics, Presbyterians, Lutherans, you name it, all of which is a crucial experience for the development of the national American identity. You know who you are also by who you are not. Then we also want to emphasize the contributions of the various states toward this victory, and the crucial contributions of France on water and on land, contributions that had started in 1777 already and lead to Yorktown, but by far are not over. And then the global manifestations of the war, and you realize there are about 10 different presentations right here in this descriptions of the goals and purposes. The legislation reads in part that this Washington-Rochambeau National Historic Trail, etc., is a corridor of approximately 600 miles. Corridor is important because you have to realize that these armies, as we shall see, are 7,000 people strong, and the largest town in New Jersey, for example, is Burlington with about 800 inhabitants. There's, other than Philadelphia, there's no town out there that would even feed all these troops. And here you see, going through New Jersey, how wide this corridor is, that always only converges where there are river crossings, etc. But after this brief paragraph of explaining what this National Historic Trail is, let's go back to Washington's diary. It addresses all important personal, political, and military issues that are underlying the march to Yorktown. Namely, there is a crisis, he says, we need a decisive plan. I'm obliged to do something, I have to do something now, and that something is giving up the idea of New York City because we need to cooperate with the force from the West Indies, namely the forces of Admiral de Grasse. Now, it is a decision, of course, that Washington takes that he does not take alone. It is a decision that is made in cooperation with the Comte de Rochambeau. Here's a portrait of him and a 18th century drawing of a Lieutenant General and Maréchal de Camp of the armies of the King of France, Comte de Rochambeau, whose headquarters were in the Odell house. This is an 1880s photograph. The house looks much better than what it looks like today, so I didn't want to scare you by that photograph first. The decision is made in cooperation with Washington, between Washington and Rochambeau, but the first question before we go there is briefly look at why are there even French forces in Westchester County and in the United States at the time? Well, for a number of reasons, as we know, King Louis XVI decided to support the fight of the American colonists, the rebels or patriots, depending on where you are, in their struggle for independence from the crown of King George III, first clandestinely and then openly with the Treaty of Friendship and Amity and the Treaty of Military Alliance in February of 1778. We all know that by late 1779, early 1780, the war's not going too well. We have the Siege of Savannah in 1779, the surrender of Charleston in May 1780. And it is in 1780, then in February 1780, that King Louis approves this plan that is codenamed Expédition Particulière, namely the transportation of a military force under the Comte de Rochambeau across the Atlantic, and a force that is large enough to decide the outcome of the War of Independence in favor of the Americans. We know that Rochambeau's forces then land in Newport in late July of 1780, and here we have a breakdown of how many people there are. And just as an aside, if Rochambeau brings about 5,000 men, the population of Newport in the summer of 1780 is 5,000 people. In other words, it doubles overnight, not to mention more than an even larger number of sailors that are on the vessels out there in the bay, right around Jamestown Island, where Miss Wade is watching us from. But if you look out the window, you said you only see rain and no vessels. But the question of population, how to feed of these is a topic, I guess, for another talk. They are encamped, French forces going to winter quarters in Newport. They encamped, for those of you who know Newport, here's the Colony House right here. Here is the Museum of Newport History. And here is where these forces are encamped. Note there's little windmills all over the place. And here we are getting a little closer here. You see windmills all over Newport. Now, I said they arrive in Newport in late July 1780. It's too late for the campaign. The troops go into winter quarters in Newport, and the cavalry hussars of Lauzon's Legion are over in Lebanon, Connecticut. If you haven't been there, it's a great place to visit. It's the largest town green in New England, virtually unspoiled by modern development, and the nearest McDonald's is at least 30 miles away. We all know that in the winter of 1780 to 81, things are getting even worse. They're going from bad to worse for the Continental Army. The Pennsylvania Line mutinies in Chalky Hollow in January, followed by the mutiny of the New Jersey Line at Pumpton. And on the 9th of April, an almost despondent Washington wrote in a letter to Lieutenant Colonel John Lawrence, "We are at the end of our tether, and now or never our deliverance must come." Washington knew that this deliverance could only come in cooperation with his French allies. But how? What are we going to do to bring about that deliverance in 1781? Well, from the 21st to the 23rd of May, 1781, the Allies decide, to a large degree upon the urgings of Washington, to lay siege to New York City. And this is actually in front of the Joseph Webb House in Wethersfield, where that conference took place with two of my very good friends. There was a wonderful reenactment there for the 225th anniversary of the conference. And so on the 22nd of May, Washington wrote into his diary, "Fixed with Comte de Rochambeau upon the plan of the campaign." And what is the plan? The plan is, and I quote the diary again, that the French land force should march to the North River, and there, in conjunction with the American, to commence an operation against New York, which in the present reduced state of the garrison was thought would fall unless relieved, and to extend our views to the southward as circumstances and their naval superiority might render more necessary and eligible. But then he goes on to talk about all the difficulties and expenses that would make a southern campaign not something that you want to do, and therefore an attack on New York City, as he writes, is preferable to any other objective. And so the two armies leave winter quarters in mid-June from Newport and Newburgh to New York City on the 6th of July, 1781. They unite around the town of Greenburgh in Westchester County. And as I said, Washington sets up his headquarters in the Apple. That's all there was left in 1933. or around 1933 already. And Washington and Rochambeau makes his headquarters in the Odell house. André Omblard of the Soissonneuil wrote that the headquarters consisted of 3 or 4 bad shacks. It all depends where you're coming from. Compared to Versailles or some of the chateaux in France, everything here probably looks like a bad shack. And so these are the headquarters. French forces and American forces are encamped right around. And what I want to do is go from an 18th century map here that identifies headquarters to a more colorful map and of the encampment here. And here's the Odell house. Quartier du Général Rochambeau is right here. Quartier du Général Washington is right here. This is the French encampment, is Heatherdale Road, Sprain Road, for those of you who know the area. If we overlay modern road pattern on this 18th century map, I think it becomes a little clearer. Here's the Sawmill River, here's the Sprain Brook, Tuckahoe Road, here's Dobbs Ferry Road, over to Dobbs Ferry. And on using an aerial photograph, now it's very clear. Here's the Ardsley High School. You can see the track. Here's the golf course, Sunningdale Golf Course, where French forces are encamped. All of this was done in a project together with Westchester County, and the report that I did on that is actually available online for those of you who want to see you. Now, while they're there in July and into August, Washington-Rochambeau are preparing for a siege of New York City and taking to New York City. There are meetings, obviously, in both houses concerning the grand reconnaissance of the 21st to the 23rd July down to where Fordham University is. Today, there are reconnaissances on the New Jersey side of the river. There are dances, of course. There are meetings, as this young lady says. She gave 4 or 5 large dinner parties in a home which was owned by Mr. Bates, which is today's Odell house there. So in other words, the time is spent getting ready for that siege. However, there is a problem, and the problem is what? On 26th July 1781, Jonathan Trumbull writes into his journal, and he is Jonathan Trumbull, painted by his brother John Trumbull, the one who painted that famous surrender scene, of course. He writes in his journal, "The general is exceedingly anxious and finds himself in a most perplexing and ridiculous situation, not being able to determine on any fixed plan of operation from the uncertainty of his expectations and prospects." That is on the 26th of July, 1781. And this seems a strange entry into a journal, isn't it? He writes about no fixed plan of operations. I thought Washington-Rochambeau had decided to lay siege to New York City. What happened? Well, what happened is, for this plan of operations that they had agreed upon and what they were going to do, they need a fleet, a French fleet. They need a naval superiority off the coast of New York City to close that siege ring around New York City. Because as long as the harbor to New York City is open and the Royal Navy can sail in and out unmolested, they are going to be sitting there, Washington-Rochambeau, with their troops for the next 50 years without being able to take New York City. Where is that fleet that they're waiting for? And it's now the 26th of July. Well, The planning of the campaign made in Wethersfield was based on the hope and assumption that there would be a fleet and that its commanding officer would do what Washington-Rochambeau wanted him to do, and that wind, weather, and the Royal Navy would not interfere. Enter the Comte de Grasse. The Comte de Grasse had sailed from Brest for the West Indies on the 22nd of March, 1781, on his flagship, the Ville de Paris, which is actually the largest vessel in the French Navy at the time, at 104 guns and a crew of about 1,500 people. Keep in mind that the largest town in New Jersey in 1781 is Burlington, with not quite 1,000. There are 1.5 times as many people on de Grasse's flagship as there live in the largest city in New Jersey. So de Grasse sailed for the West Indies on the 22nd of March, gets into Martinique on the 28th of April, then goes to Port Royal and enters the harbor of Cap Français in Haiti on the 16th of July. Now let's put this into a bit of a larger geographic context. We said that on the 22nd of March, right, de Grasse sailed from Brest. Who is where on the 22nd of March? Washington and Continental Army on winter quarters in Newburgh. Rochambeau and French forces are in Newport, Rhode Island. Lord Cornwallis is in North Carolina. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse is on the 15th of March. And Admiral Thomas Graves and Sir Samuel Foote are in the West Indies. In other words, they are hundreds of miles at best from Yorktown in March of 1781. As I said, Comte de Grasse arrives in Cap Français on the 16th of July. At the time of the Wethersfield Conference, de Grasse is in Martinique. What are Washington's and Rochambeau's plans again? They want to lay siege to New York City. Where does de Grasse figure into the equation? Well, hopefully, he will sail from Martinique to New York City. But we have to tell him first that that's what we want him to do. And Cornwallis, well, he's in North Carolina. He can go pretty much anywhere he wants to. There's no way Washington, Rochambeau, de Grasse, or anybody can force Cornwallis to go to New York City. Rochambeau learns of de Grasse's departure from Brest via letter on the 28th of March, which he receives on the 10th of June. In other words, he learns that de Grasse is on his way to the West Indies 3 weeks after they already decided that de Grasse is going to be outside New York City in the summer of 1781. But based on this letter that arrives on the 10th of June, Allied forces set out for Greenberg, 12th of June, the French forces, 22nd of June, the Continental Army. But de Grasse has also informed Rochambeau that he will be off the coast by the 15th of July at the latest. Washington and Rochambeau do everything they're supposed to be doing. By the 6th of July, the Allied armies are in Greenberg. But where is de Grasse? Well, we just learned that he sailed into Cap Français on the 16th of July. Clearly, de Grasse is weeks behind schedule, and now you understand why Trumbull gets nervous and why Washington get nervous. They are weeks behind. Nobody knows where de Grasse is or where he's going to be and when he is going to come. Without knowing where de Grasse is, there's not much Washington can do in May and June or July other than concentrate his forces north of New York City, because that is the plan. We know that Lafayette is down in Virginia at the time, but Washington has no idea where exactly he is. Even on the 12th of June, he writes to Rochambeau, My last accounts from the Marquis de Lafayette were of the 3rd of June. The British Army were then between Richmond and Fredericksburg. Their destination was uncertain, but from their superiority, they were at full liberty to go wherever they pleased. In other words, there's nobody who can force Cornwallis to go to Yorktown. They are free to go wherever they please. And if they stay in Fredericksburg or go back to North Carolina, actually, it doesn't matter where de Grasse goes, because the French fleet doesn't help if Cornwallis, as some people thought, keeps on marching north and will end up in Baltimore, for example. On the 27th of July, and time goes by, the day after Trumbull had written to his father, Washington's chief engineer, Presley du Portail, starts work on a plan to lay siege to New York City without the support of the French fleet. By now, Washington says, well, they're probably never going to come, but we got to do something because time is not on our side. And du Portail arrives at the conclusion that if there's a large number of boats that can be brought over secretly over land to the Harlem River, and then taking of the island might be attempted, and at least it's something. But he thought in his plan, du Portail thought that he would need at least 20,000 men. Du Portail, Washington-Rochambeau all knew that there were not 20,000 men, much less any of the supplies needed to embark on an operation on that scale. Yet, on the 14th of August, Washington, as we know, can finally determine on a fixed plan of operations, even if that is not at all what he had in mind. Mathieu Dumas, who is one of Rochambeau's aides de camp, had been out on a foraging expedition on the 14th of August and had entered into his diary. Il est arrivé ce soir un courrier de Newport. This evening, a courier arrived from Newport who had departed on the 12th. Monsieur de Barras announced to the general the arrival of the frigate La Concorde. There's never been a more aptly named frigate, I think, in US American history. Arrival of the frigate La Concorde, which had departed Cap Français on 28 July. All communication between the frigate and land has been prohibited. Clearly, there's something going on. That frigate brought some kind of information, and it did indeed bring a letter from de Grasse informing Rochambeau and Washington that he was sailing from Saint-Domingue to render himself in all diligence to the Chesapeake Bay. De Grasse is sailing to the Chesapeake Bay. The next day, Dumas wrote into his journal, nothing has leaked about the details that the generals received via the Concorde, and the decision they made after a conference of several hours is just as secret. But Monsieur de Fersen, another aide de camp to Rochambeau, and some nasty tongues say the father of the Dauphin that's born a couple years later, Monsieur de Fersen was sent to Newport this morning. There had been a meeting of several hours. Dumas had not been present, but the account by the Comte de Lauverdière, another aide de camp who's also Rochambeau's nephew, reads as if he had been there. The journal of the Comte de Lauverdière is going to be published coincidentally in English by a translation by my good friend Norman Desmarais from Providence, as well as in French, and that just came out this year. Lauverdière writes into his journal, We foraged again around Eastchester on the 14th, just like Dumas. The Comte de Rochambeau received information about the arrival of the frigate La Concorde at Newport on the 14th. She was sent from Martinique by Monsieur de Grasse in response to the dispatches that Monsieur de Rochambeau had sent to him by the same frigate in the month of April. The admiral was sending it to our general only after careful consideration of the plan of campaign. De Grasse had agreed that he would begin to embark as many troops as he could on board his navy's vessels, but go to the Chesapeake Bay for the immediate relief of Virginia. He would also exert himself to bring 1.2 million livres, which were requested of him, and he would arrive in the Chesapeake Bay before the end of August. And the letter gets to Westchester County, to the Odell House, because that's where Washington is. When? On the 14th of August. But if before the end of August, in 2 weeks or less, de Grasse will be in the Chesapeake. You know how far it is from Westchester County down to Yorktown to Norfolk, right? It's over 450 miles to go. Let me continue with a quote from Louverdière. Monsieur de Rochambeau went out to search for General Washington to inform him of this satisfactory and important missive. The general, who had always had only New York in his heart, did not appear very satisfied, not only because the expedition to the Chesapeake did not appear to him important, and not important is in capital letters in the manuscript, but because he thought that the reduction of New York would end the war. Now, Louverdière does not say where Rochambeau found Washington or where the conversation took place, but as Dumas wrote, it was a long one. It lasted several hours. Washington brings his arguments. As Louverdière writes, he believed in the possibility of this great enterprise, but knowing the almost invincible repugnance of the troops from the northern states to go south, he feared that nobody would follow him. And as a matter of fact, once they get to Head of Elk in northern Maryland to Delaware, desertions do arise precipitously. Monsieur de Rochambeau countered all these objections forcefully and with knowledge of the facts. And he finally told him that matters were too far advanced to back out, that he, Rochambeau, was determined to march, come what may, with a body of French, which united with the troops promised him from the islands, that's Saint-Simon, with about 3,500 men, which would be sufficient, and that Washington would neglect his own glory, and that he only had the common good in mind. In other words, this sounds as if Rochambeau is putting the pistol on Washington's chest. Come what may, I will leave with my forces. It's up to you. You can come or you stay. And Louverdière goes on to say, il le priait instamment. He insistently requested that Washington come personally to Virginia, where he would find Monsieur de Lafayette, and that eventually General Washington agreed and preoccupied himself only with how to convince his troops and to bring as many of them as possible with him. General Washington gave up and occupied himself with nothing else but how to win over the troops and how to take with him as many as possible. Now keep in mind, this is one side. This is a young aide-de-camp speaking, right? Rochambeau himself doesn't say anything about this meeting. Dumas only is not there at all. He just knows it from the outside, looking in, that something important must have happened. But there's one more eyewitness, and that's Chief Engineer de Saint-Ouen. who's always a member of the innermost circle around Washington and Rochambeau, du Parti, sorry, I said this way, it's du Parti, the chief whom I'm just quoted, who had plans drawn up to attack New York City without a French fleet, who writes in a letter to the Washington in French, which for some reason the Washington papers online have not translated. He writes, General Washington, we are with Descendrois, okay, Descendrois. Descendrois writes in his journal, General Washington had his head so full of the reduction of New York that he never wanted to consent to any other movement of his or of Monsieur de Rochambeau's army. Moreover, when Monsieur de Rochambeau received via the Concorde the news that Admiral de Grasse was going to Chesapeake, a broken-hearted, he uses the term désolé, a broken-hearted Washington wanted to send to Monsieur du Parti, to that admiral, to get him to return for an attack against New York City. Now, even though Descendrois and Laubertière Rochambeau pointed out that de Grasse had come to Virginia at his request, that Washington has to go to Virginia because of that, and that Washington should place himself at our head, as Laubertière wrote, and to make that part of the army follow him, which he thought he could draw away from New York City. Nevertheless, Washington still is hesitant. He is hesitant until du Parti shows up. He's the brigadier who had received orders to prepare for a march, for an assault in New York City without a navy. As Vicomte de Rochambeau, the son of Rochambeau, writes in his journal, my father sent for the brigadier du Parti, told him all of his ideas, which he completely approved, and asked him to use all of his influence with the American commander to make him adopt them. And eventually, with the obstacles removed, the march south was resolved upon and definitely planned, end of quote. And we know that du Parti was at the meeting because of this note of 15 August, which he sent to Washington, where he wrote, Dear General, I send to your Excellency, according to your orders, the few general observations I have done, although the news we had yesterday make me afraid that they are now inutile. Your other plans must be done. It is not advantageous to pursue the preparations for the attack on New York, etc., etc. There are 5 eyewitness accounts of that meeting. Unfortunately, they are all French, but they are better than nothing. Obviously, Washington is very circumspect, but they all point out that what Washington had written in his diary and what he wrote in letters, such as the one he wrote a week later to Governor Trumbull in Connecticut, where he writes, I feel myself unhappy to be obliged to inform your Excellency that the circumstances in which I find myself at this late period have induced me to make an alteration of the main object which was at first adopted, namely the attack on New York City. Washington was unhappy, but that's one of the grandest understatements, even if French forces need to be taken with a grain of salt. In other words, Washington simply had been forced to admit, painfully maybe, that even though he was nominally the commander-in-chief, he was also militarily the weakest link in this triumvirate between Washington, between Rochambeau, de Grasse, and himself, and they all knew it. Just looking at the strength of French forces on the eve of departure from Greenberg. We have about 4,200. The Continental Army is maybe 2,300, a little more than half of the strength of the French forces that march. French sources do not tell the whole story, however, because Washington is indeed taking very great risks by changing his mind, by agreeing to go to Yorktown, to go to Virginia, because for one, he makes that decision to march to Yorktown without knowing where Cornwallis is. Remember, he had written to Rochambeau, he is at liberty to go wherever he wants to go. And on the 12th of August, Washington writes in his diary, by accounts this day received from the Marquis de Lafayette, which is a letter dated the 1st of August, it appeared that the transports in Hampton Road that stood up the bay came to at a distance of 15 miles, and that his lordship had commenced his march toward Fredericksburg, that he might more readily oppose his operations on the Potomac or march up the Chesapeake Bay. In other words, when he writes this in his diary, he does not know where Cornwallis is and what he's doing. It's only on the 16th, the order to go to York to Virginia had already been given, that he receives a letter from the Marquis de Lafayette, which informs, as Washington writes, that Lord Cornwallis with the troops had proceeded up York River and landed at York and Gloucester towns, where they were throwing up works. In other words, it looks as if Cornwallis is doing exactly what Washington would have wanted him to do. Take up a base on a river where the French fleet coming to the Chesapeake can block him in on water, if only land forces, now Washington and Rochambeau's forces, get there in time. And so they set out. But again, keep in mind, by taking all of the French forces that are in Westchester County and more than half of the Continental Army to Virginia, he leaves General Heath with fewer than 4,000 troops to defend the Highlands, to defend Connecticut, New York State, New Jersey against Sir Henry Clinton, who has almost 15,500 troops in New York City. Sir Henry Clinton can go, if he decides he wants to do something, he can march anywhere in New England and the mid-Atlantic states, because French forces and the Continental Army are gone. And the third point that I think points out how great a risk Washington is taking is because he doesn't know where de Grasse is on the 14th of August. De Grasse writes to him, I'm going to be in the Chesapeake for the end of the month. But that letter is written in July. Does Washington know whether de Grasse actually sailed? Does he know whether there had been a hurricane or some other event in the West Indies? Does he know anything about where the Royal Navy is? De Grasse is off here in Martinique down here. The Royal Navy is here in Montserrat. On the 5th of August, de Grasse sailed from Cap Francois. On the 10th of August, as you see here, the Royal Navy under Sir Samuel Hood sailed for the American mainland. On the 17th of August, this we see here, Legate picks up funds in Cuba and Havana, and then joins the fleet as it sails through the old canal here. Now, looking at the chronology, right? De Grasse leaves on the 5th. From here, the Royal Navy leaves on the 10th. It doesn't take a mathematician to figure out that it's the grouse that actually should be in the Chesapeake Bay before Hood gets there. Well, here's an example of technological advantage or advancing can be a disadvantage because Hood's vessels are all copper sheath and they sail considerably faster than the grouse. So when Hood sails along here, he does not look into the Chesapeake Bay as he later claims, because if he had, he would have known that Cornwallis is in there. No, he just kind of sails very cavalierly along here. If he had, but even if he had, he wouldn't have found the grouse because the grouse gets into the Chesapeake Bay when on the 28th of August. So the grouse now is on time. He said he would be there before the end of the month. By the 28th of August, we already know, of course, that French and American forces are on their way from the Odell house. And this is what it looked like not too long ago. But I know Miss Susan Seal, whom welcome, is working very hard to restore that to its original, as much as possible, its original condition, and maybe turn it into a visitor center or an information center for the Yorktown campaign, which eventually assures American independence, as we know. So on the 14th of August, I said Washington-Rochambeau learned in a letter that he's on the way to Chesapeake. That gives them 62 days and 450 miles, or 58 days from the 18th of August when they finally set off to march to Virginia. How fast do they move? Well, they move as fast as the ox carts will go, because you can make a horse gallop, but you cannot make an ox run. They move at a speed of 10 to 12 miles per day. If you put some rest days in there, the estimated time of arrival will be the 6th or the 7th of October. And in his letter of the 28th of July, de Grasse had said he will stay until the 15th of October. Again, talk about time pressure, because if they get there by the 6th or 7th of October, that doesn't even give them 10 days. It gives 1 week to lay siege to Cornwallis and to force his surrender. 28th of August, we said, where are Washington and Rochambeau on the 28th of August? Whoops, this is not supposed, yeah, let's look at this real quick. Who knows what? The march to Yorktown, of course, had to be kept from Clinton, from Sir Henry Clinton, away his knowledge as quickly as possible, as much as possible, to keep some secrecy on the march. But by the 19th of August, as you see here already, the young is a letter to Marquardt that eventually is who now runs the British spy system after the execution of Major André, says that the French artillery moved yesterday afternoon on the 18th of August. Exactly. They struck their tents that will cross the North River at Dobbs Ferry and at King's Ferry via North Castle. Exactly correct. A couple of days later, Colonel Rochambeau, the son, told his girl yesterday that she must be at North Castle. His mistress is a Rhode Island lady that follows him unknown to his father, who will allow no kept mistresses. His father, Rochambeau, does not know about the mistress, but the British know. British know everything. By the 21st of August, Frederick Mackenzie already writes that I think it's probable if Monsieur de Grasse comes, he will endeavor to go to the Chesapeake. In that case, the design is the destruction of Lord Cornwallis's army. And the next day he writes, if he actually gets there, it will be impossible for us to help Lord Cornwallis unless we march very, very quickly. Why Sir Henry Clinton does not react and tried to intercept the Allied forces on the march to New Jersey. It's one of the mysteries of the War of Independence. So where are the Allied forces on the 28th of August? 28th of August, that day that de Grasse sails into the Chesapeake Bay. Well, the Continental Army is between Chatham and Springfield, and French forces are in Whippany. We still got 400 miles to go. No matter how you twist and turn it, it's going to be 5th or 6th of October. De Grasse will stay until the 15th of October. Washington can do the math too, how fast they have to move. And actually, the French wagon train arrives on 7th of October outside Yorktown. Washington learns of the arrival of de Grasse in the afternoon of the 5th of September, 1781, in Marcus Hook. Sir Henry Clinton knew that already. He had learned it a couple of days earlier on there. On that same 5th of September, literally the same hour as Washington learns of the arrival of de Grasse of the Chesapeake Bay, of course, the Battle of the Capes begins. A Battle of the Capes, which really decides the outcome of the Yorktown campaign. Because if de Grasse is defeated, then the Royal Navy will sail into Yorktown. Cornwallis will embark on the Royal Navy vessels and sail out of the Chesapeake Bay. And by the time Washington and Rochambeau get there, they can simply, all they can do is wave and say, what happened? Why did you leave? But we all know, of course, that is not what happened. We know that Washington arrived in Williamsburg on the 14th of September. His forces get there on the 27th of September. The siege begins on the 28th of October. De Grasse agrees to stay an extra 2 weeks, long enough so that on the 19th of October, Cornwallis can be forced to surrender. Now, why did I title my talk like this? Ed Lengel, a much more famous historian than I am, wrote in his book, George Washington, A Military Life, no decision that Washington made in his long military career was more important than this one. And as I said, it was not an easy decision. Washington was taking great risks when he decided to throw long-held plans overboard on the 14th of August and take his armies to Virginia. It would be interesting to find an American eyewitness that was there at the meeting, not just Rochambeau, Lobedière, de Saint-Douin, Duportail, and Washington and Rochambeau's son, but I haven't found one yet. It is so much easier for Rochambeau to argue for Yorktown. If the plan worked out, great. If not, the worst that could have happened to Rochambeau and his forces was that they would be defeated, taken prisoner, and sent back to France after the conclusion of peace. You know, win some, lose some concept. But for the Americans, defeat on the way to Yorktown or before Yorktown would mean the end of the struggle for independence. There can be no doubt about that. But Americans, the rebels, could not just go home and continue as before, because for Washington and the national United States, everything depended on the outcome of this campaign. Everything. So now you see why it took hours for Washington struggling with this, the most important decision of his career. In the end, I think it doesn't matter so much how long it took Washington to make up his mind, how much pressure Rochambeau may or may not have put on him. What matters is that Washington did make the decision because it was his and only his to make. He would bear the responsibility for victory or defeat. And in retrospect, we all know that he made the right decision, because a few months after that decision, Lord Cornwallis did surrender. The United States would be an independent nation, and it stops and spurs rose to become the most powerful nation on earth. And thus, on the 14th of August, the 14th of August is indeed, I think, the day that shook the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Selig, there may be a couple of questions in the Q&A down here on the bottom of your screen. I don't know if you can see them and or perhaps answer them.
Sure. There's a question by Julie Odell. In the 6 weeks that Rochambeau had his headquarters in the Odell house, would he have set up his own belongings or used the furniture that was in the house at the time? He traveled with his own furniture. He had half a dozen wagons just for himself, and I forget, a dozen or more servants, etc. He would have had his own furniture. You just don't know where you're going to end up in this process. I mean, Châteauneuf had one wagon just with wine as he set out on one of his journeys. Though they decided once they hit Connecticut, to just drink it, it would take too long and be too lumbersome. Next question is, you're really at the Doran's House Tavern, which is right on the Rhode Island, New Jersey, Connecticut state line, is still standing. If you read Châteauneuf's account, that's where they decided to just drink all the wine and be done with it. Are there many surviving letters written by Rochambeau from the Odell house? Very few. And the letters are mostly to de Grasse or to Chevalier de la Lucerne in Philadelphia. There are a couple to France. Those letters have all been published by Doniol. It's a 5-volume set of documents about the role of France in the War of Independence, published in the 1890s. And there's a whole section, and I think it's volume 5, that has Rochambeau's correspondence in there. And lastly, who else possibly stayed in the Odell house with Rochambeau? Probably his aides, 2 or 3 aides. The camp would be certainly, if not in the house itself, then in one of these other barns that the barracks huts that Ancio describes. So they would have been in his neighborhood. But don't forget, someone like Rochambeau had, I think, 12 or 15 servants. Baron Close and all of the aides to the camp have 5 or 6 servants at all time. When Gromont du Bourg and Baron Closen ride from Annapolis to Williamsburg, those 2 officers have a total train of 18 horses to get there. I've yet to read about the first, even lowliest second lieutenant in the French army, who only has 2 servants. They all have more. So it was a whole camp, literally, around the Odell house. And the same in the case of the Appleby house too, with Washington. There's a British spy report that says that he constantly has 60 men of his, I think it's 60 men of his lifeguard encamped around him, around the Appleby house. Quite rightly so, because there's at least one known attempt to kidnap Washington in Westchester County. So the idea that Washington or somebody's riding somewhere is somewhat misleading, because they're all in groups of 12, 15, 20 people and more very, very quickly. That includes Washington too, of course. He doesn't just ride.
Ball. I just threw the ball.
So.
Oops.
Thank you very much, Dr. Selig. I really appreciate your giving us the time and expertise and great slides as well. And I thank everybody for attending this, our first Zoom program for the Daughters of Cincinnati. It's been really quite a fun experience. And I hope that people will look online and get the maps and go out and drive this particular Washington-Rochambeau revolutionary route. It's fascinating. I know in Connecticut, the towns that they went through are absolutely charming. It's a great way to break the pandemic and get out there and do a road trip. So I encourage you all to do that. And thank you all, and good night to you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Caroline,
Thank
could I
you,
just say
Carolyn.
one more thing? One of the questions
Sure.
here, considering the length of time that Rochambeau stayed in Odell House, it's one of the most important surviving sites, I think, on the whole trail. And as you were saying, the driving the trail, the reports with the routes are all on the website of the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary route, and you don't have to drive them. There were people who walk them too. It just takes a couple months. I thank you all very much for spending the an hour and a half or more with me. I hope you learned something, and thank you very much to the Daughters of the Cincinnati for inviting me for tonight.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Carolyn, for doing this.
Very welcome. All right, Shannon, I think we
Thank
can
you.
conclude. All
Okay.
right.
Have a good
Good
night.
night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.